We'd like very much to invite the next speaker, Professor Omri Abend, where the discussion will be around the narrative analysis of the Holocaust testimonies. So very important topic from the Department of Computer Science and Department of Cognitive and Brain at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Stage is for you.
So thank you for this invitation. I will be talking about a project that we're leading in the Hebrew University with a diverse set of colleagues listed here: Yossi Adi, Avishai Elmakayes, Maxim Ifergan, Ranana Keidar, Amit Pinchevsky, Esther Shizgal, Itamar Treinin, and Eitan Wagner. And the topic is a collaboration between social scientists, scientists of the humanities, computer scientists such as myself, across various disciplines. So our motivation in this project is actually threefold. We aim to build tools for computational analysis of Holocaust testimonies, of testimonies given by Holocaust survivors. And this, of course, has a moral motivation, right? Our obligation to hear the voices of the witnesses. It's also important historically. The set of testimonies collected by various organizations of Holocaust survivors has been an incredibly useful and important resource in Holocaust studies, in history, and in many other fields. And third of all, I believe that this is a very interesting test case in terms of computational narrative analysis. The reason for that is that we have here a rather sizable set of narratives. So tens of thousands of testimonies were recorded all in all. So that's quite a sizable resource, which is also thematically restricted, right? It's relatively confined to a specific context, a specific period in time, and a specific locations. Of course, not exactly, but taking the entire space of narratives into account, this of course only covers a very small fraction, and this might be an advantage in terms of statistical learning and in terms of making some first steps in computational narrative analysis and under researched field so far. We look at testimonies collected by the Shoah Foundation in USC in English. And here it's important to note that while this resource has been the focus of much previous research, most of it focused on small set of testimonies that were read by experts of the field, and so only a very small set of testimonies was heard. So the goals here is both the humanist goal, if you will, or the moral goal, if you will, which is to listen to all testimonies, or at least to, in some sense, to get a grasp of the entire space of testimonies and not only the few that have been studied closely so far. And also our goal is, or the joint goal is, to discover trends in this large set of narratives so we can depict them or visualize them or get a sense of them in some way. So both to find recurring patterns of telling the story, and deviations from those patterns. Our approach here to narrative analysis, of course, narrative analysis is a very broad, abstract term, and you can think of many, many types of analyses you might want to do with a narrative text. Here we specifically look at representation that represents narratives as progressions of the text along multiple dimensions. So I'll give some examples of that, but dimensions such as locations, such as the topics, such as the religious dispositions of the witnesses. So we have various semantic dimensions, and we want to track how they change along the text of the testimony. Why do we do that? Well, this has several motivations, but this is just one. So the different testimonies, while they were all given in roughly the same format, they're all roughly of the same length, give or take. They talk about the same period of history, more or less. There's still quite a lot of differences between them. For instance, they advance in different paces, right? So one witness might give much more emphasis to their experiences during the war or in some particular year of the war, while others might give more emphasis and devote more time to their childhood or to what happened right after the war and so on. So we want to somehow, in order to find patterns in these narratives, we need to somehow align them, right? We need to look at testimonies and to be able to identify, in some sense, parallel segments of those testimonies. And for that, we need some kind of analysis to cast it in terms of a progression of the text along multiple dimensions. So the first dimension we pursued is the topical dimension, right? So we had these very coarse-grained categories such as migration, Jewish life and faith. So we had these coarse-grained categories that were defined in advance by experts, and our task here was to segment the text into segments where each of them has as its main topic that designated label. Right, and we faced quite a few challenges here. Of course, the domain and language are atypical for natural language processing work. There's a lot of background knowledge that is needed, right? The witness giving the testimony usually assumes that the common ground that they have with the interviewer is quite extensive, that the interviewer already knows quite a bit about the Holocaust, and this is important for the analysis. And of course, the boundaries also depend on the set of topics, right? So it's not that we segment separately and classify separately, they somehow have to be done jointly. We used here the Shoah Foundation's index or taxonomy, and we projected it to 29 coarse-grained categories. There is some existing annotation, but that was not over topical segments, but rather over 1-minute segments, and they are multi-label. So we had to do some legwork here, but essentially the idea was to segment the text and to assign each segment with one of these 29 categories. Our results surprised us a bit. It was much more difficult than we expected. Actually, the thing that worked best, and this is not a very good indication, as I will explain in a minute, the thing that worked best was a very simple method that simply looked at the pointwise mutual information, right, at places where the pointwise mutual information was low. So essentially, it looked for those places in the text where it is difficult to predict the next sentence or the next few sentences from the previous ones. Why am I saying that this is a bit disappointing? Because this very simple method that then just greedily takes the first, K boundary points where the PMI is low, it does not take into account the structure of the testimony, right? Doesn't take into account additional background knowledge and so on, except for what has been learned during pre-training. And indeed, the segment quality was quite mediocre. We're trying to make some headway using auditory cues, right? So to actually not use only the transcribed text, but to actually use the audio. And this is joint work with Avishai and Yossi I mentioned earlier. Okay, we also looked at a different approach. So as I said, these are different projects under the same umbrella, under the same large project. So we looked at a different direction where we tried to generate sets of topics from the sets of documents, right? So instead of assuming we have these 29 or whatever set categories and that we want to map into, it makes sense now that we have Gen AI to try and generate them using various language models or using some kind of combination of more classical methods such as LDA and newer stuff like GPT-4. And this is just two lists we generated. What you see here on these lists is that they're not very satisfying, right? So these lists were compiled from a set of segments addressing, according at least to the Shoah Foundation, anti-Semitism or expressions of anti-Semitism. GPT-4 mentioned one of the topics as just anti-Semitism, so obviously that's a bit too broad as all the documents focus on that. We had some repetitions, but maybe that's easy to filter, like in the ones that you see there in green, the pair that you see in green. But we also had these near repetitions, right, or topics that have substantial overlap. And again, we need to somehow define what it is exactly that we're looking for, right? I mean, what's a good set of topics to describe a set of documents? So actually what we ended up doing was build an evaluation methodology. So this is work that's currently under review. I will not have time to discuss it, but I'm happy to talk about it later. Another dimension where we try to represent the categories along is the locations, right? So in a story, it's usually very important to know where that story takes place, right? So we can look at the trajectory of location that the witness has testifies that they have been through. And of course, this is not easy at all because that witness very likely mentions many locations in which they were not, locations they were not actually in. So for instance, locations where acquaintances of them were in, or that their family is originally from, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, many locations are implied in the text and are not actually written explicitly. So here again, we started from a closed set of locations and moved to an open set. Starting from the closed set, we again used the Shoah Foundation's existing index, and again mapped it to a coarse-grained set of categories. We used various methods here, again using some combination of large language models and more classical methods, such as conditional random fields, and all sorts of various baselines based on more classical work in NLP, such as named entity recognition. What ended up working best was a kind of a hierarchical model where we embed each segment using a transformer encoder, a pre-trained transformer encoder, and then this embedding of the segment is fed into another encoder, so an encoder over segment embeddings, which then outputs, does some kind of joint prediction of the various locations. So rather straightforward architecture, but that worked fine for us. We had 105 categories, and basically the results were here. They made much more sense, or they were much more encouraging. Also, the quality was much better than in the previous one. Wide context models worked better than local models. Conditional random fields were better than the baselines, but in turn, the hierarchical transformers were better than them. And using location embeddings, so that is first embedding the different locations in some kind of vector space, worked better than just looking at locations as a discrete set of categories, because obviously some locations are nearer, semantically at least, if not geographically, to one another. And again, we made the move from a closed set of categories to an open set. Here we had a pilot on end-to-end prediction with GPT-4. So instead of looking at segments and classifying each to a location, we looked at an open set of locations and not segment-based. So we just fed entire segments or entire parts of the testimony into GPT-4. And this is, of course, much more flexible and simple to run and uses stronger technology. But other than its inefficiency, again, here we face problems where we don't actually know what we want, how we want to evaluate it. It's difficult to define it, and it's difficult to control the models so as to give us some standardized answer. But still, results here were rather encouraging, unlike in the first case. We essentially what we did is generated graphs using the output of language models such as GPT-4 and others, which identified the locations, classified them into their different types, countries, cities, camps, and we could then draw trajectories. But of course, there are many, many issues to address here, as you might imagine. Some locations appear in different nodes or written slightly differently, and there is sometimes some overlap between the location, right? One unit that contains the other, and all sorts of things that make it much more difficult to evaluate and actually to guide it through some standard format. In a nutshell, we're also looking at religious trajectory, so the disposition expressed by the witnesses towards religious practice and belief. So this is, again, a very important trajectory that Holocaust researchers have looked at. We can take, again, the testimony and identify expressions like, it's a miracle that she's alive, we had Shabbat, or there is no God, and where it exactly happened in the testimony, in what percentile, say. And we can classify whether they refer to the practice or to the belief of the witness, right? So here, these two talk more about beliefs. We had Shabbat is the practice, and whether they express a positive or negative sentiment or something else. And again, draw trajectories, cluster them, and try to find recurring schema. So let me just conclude with because I'm out of time. So narrative analysis is, of course, much broader than the set of sequences that I just mentioned. Not only are there more semantic dimensions to explore, but there are many other aspects of the notion of a narrative than what I have described. So I think that there's much more work to do. Our basic motivation is to take sets of testimonies, here Holocaust survivor testimonies, to extract from them the schemas, so the types, right, the recurring patterns, and then identify in each testimony whether it adheres to certain patterns or deviates from them, and how we do so. And one inspiration for us was this work by Maria Antoniak, not ours, where she looked at birth stories given by women that gave birth and draw some kind of flow chart. So this is another interesting representation we hope to get at in our context. So thanks a lot.
Professor Omri, this is really fascinating, and I think very, very important job that you are doing. Question?
Hey, can you please elaborate a bit about the location embeddings you use there?
The location embeddings?
Yeah, in the trajectory.
So yeah, so how did you actually find them? So we tried.
What kind of embeddings? You said you replaced like regular text embeddings with specialized location embeddings. Did you use the coordinates? How did you embed the locations?
So we tried a couple of things. I think the main one that we used was just embedding, essentially static word embeddings, right? So it was projection into some kind of semantic space rather than geographical space, because, for instance, concentration camps, for instance, might be in some sense close to one another, even if they're geographically more distant than other places, and so forth, ghettos and so on. But there are also, we're now trying to establish collaboration with a famous geographer of the Holocaust. So there's apparently a lot of work on this topic, and to actually try to feed it with something much more nuanced. Because as I said, many of the texts are very difficult to understand without having background knowledge about what has happened. And on the other hand, there is a lot of data, even knowledge bases, right? Even computer readable knowledge bases about the Holocaust that we are now trying to leverage in collaboration with experts in the field.
We have another question.
Have you found a new here? Have you managed to find new narratives that were unknown or?
So what my colleagues in the humanities tell me, so I'm not exactly sure whether I understood it, but I'll try to answer and tell me if I get you right. So what I understand from my colleagues in the humanities, that in order to create a kind of effective discourse between the researchers, and given that when you do it manually, you really have to invest a lot of time in each testimony to get all the nuances right. There's actually a very small set of testimonies that researchers have conversed about. So in this sense, already what we're doing, we're here, this is work based on 1,000 testimonies in total, is already extending the set quite a bit. But if you're asking me about whether we have new findings that, kind of new exciting findings for for the humanists, right, for the Holocaust researchers, then I'm not sure that we at this point have. What we have is validations mostly. So we are definitely trying to look at, as I said, patterns and deviations from these patterns and to see whether they make sense. So just to give one example, we had another project not mentioned here where we looked at patterns that are typical for female witnesses versus male witnesses, right? And there we found things that kind of make sense. So we looked at, for instance, female testimonies given by female witnesses, which were closest to the main patterns extracted from the men's, right, from the males' testimonies. And there, and the other way around, and what we found there kind of made sense to us. So, for instance, we had the male one that was closest to the female patterns was, for instance, a testimony given by someone who was a baby during the Holocaust, and so the voices that he expresses are mostly not their own. So it's more of an echo of his parents' recollections of what has happened. So, yeah.
Okay, we will need to stop the question, even is it fascinating and amazing. Really, thank you very much, Professor Omri. Please continue. This is very important, really.